The crystalline halls of Station Zenara stretched endlessly in every direction, their walls carved from minerals that glowed with soft blue light. This was the heart of galactic civilization, the place where over 400 species gathered to decide the fate of worlds. Today, the council chambers were filled with delegates from every corner of the known universe, and the air hummed with tension that even the most ancient species could feel. High, Arbiter Velkin of the Thracian Empire stood at the central podium, his tall insectoid form casting long shadows across the polished floor. His four eyes scanned the assembly with cold calculation, and his mandibles clicked together as he prepared to speak. The Thracians had ruled over dozens of star systems for millennia, conquering and absorbing species that dared to oppose them. Velkin considered himself the most powerful being in the galaxy, and no one had ever given him reason to doubt this belief. He had crushed rebellions, annexed planets, and bent entire civilizations to his will. Today, he would add another conquest to his already impressive legacy. He raised one clawed hand, and the chamber fell into immediate silence. When he spoke, his voice resonated through translation devices that rendered his words into hundreds of languages simultaneously. Every delegate listened with careful attention, because when the High Arbiter spoke, the galaxy trembled. A new species had emerged in a distant spiral arm of the galaxy, he announced with a tone of mild disgust. They called themselves humans, and they came from a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. For nearly 2 centuries, they had been broadcasting radio signals into space, announcing their presence to anyone who cared to listen. They were like children shouting in the darkness, completely unaware of the dangers that lurked beyond their tiny world. Velkin had been listening very carefully to their transmissions, and he had decided that something needed to be done about them. He activated the holographic display, and an image of Earth appeared floating above the podium. The assembled delegates leaned forward with curiosity as the planet slowly rotated before their eyes. It was beautiful in its own primitive way, with swirling white clouds and vast blue oceans that sparkled in the light of its sun. Green continents spread across its surface, and thin wisps of atmosphere clung to its edges like a delicate veil. But beauty meant nothing to Velkin. What mattered was the species that lived upon its surface and the threat they might one day pose. Humans were primitive, he explained with barely concealed contempt dripping from every word. They had only recently developed the ability to travel beyond their own atmosphere. They had walked on their single moon just a few decades ago, taking tiny steps that they considered giant leaps. They still fought wars among themselves over resources and ideology, killing their own kind with brutal efficiency. They polluted their own world with industrial waste and burned fossil fuels, like ignorant savages who did not understand the damage they caused. By any reasonable measure, they were barely worth noticing, let alone fearing. But there was a problem that Velkin could not ignore. These humans were advancing at an alarming rate that defied all historical patterns. In less than 2 centuries, they had gone from riding horses to building spacecraft. They had split the atom, decoded their own genetic structure, and created thinking machines. They were curious beyond reason, aggressive beyond measure, and frighteningly adaptable to any challenge they faced. If left unchecked, they might become a genuine threat to galactic stability within just a few generations. The Council could not afford to wait and see. What happened when these creatures finally ventured beyond their solar system, Velkin proposed a simple and elegant solution to this emerging problem. A preemptive strike would eliminate the threat before it had a chance to grow into something unmanageable. His fleet would travel to Earth, destroy their primitive military capabilities, force the survivors to accept Thracian governance. The humans would become a subject species, their resources harvested for the benefit of the Empire, their population put to work serving their new masters. It was the natural order of things that had governed the galaxy since time began. The strong conquered the weak, and the weak learned to serve, or they perished. Murmurs rippled through the assembly, as delegates consulted with one another in hushed voices. Some expressed concern about attacking a species that had done nothing wrong, arguing that preemptive warfare set a dangerous precedent. Others worried about the resources required for such a distant expedition and questioned whether the effort was truly worthwhile. But most simply shrugged and accepted the inevitable outcome that everyone could see coming. The Thracians were powerful beyond measure, and no one wanted to oppose them over the fate of some insignificant primitives on the other side of the galaxy. High in the observation gallery, a lone figure watched the proceedings with growing dread that she struggled to conceal. Ambassador Kira Lawson was the first human to set foot in the council chambers. Granted observer status just 3 cycles earlier, as a diplomatic gesture that now seemed like a cruel joke. She was tall and composed, with dark hair pulled back from her face and sharp eyes that missed nothing happening on the floor below. She'd been sent to learn about galactic civilization and establish friendly relations with humanity's cosmic neighbors. Instead, she was witnessing her entire species being sentenced to destruction by creatures who considered them nothing more than insects to be crushed. The vote began with terrible efficiency. Species after species cast their decision, and the results appeared on the central display in glowing numbers that climbed steadily higher. Kira watched as the count mounted in favor of the invasion, each vote another nail in humanity's coffin. The Morvani abstained, citing philosophical objections to preemptive warfare and refusing to participate in what they called an immoral act. The Velkhani voted against, their ambassadors speaking passionately about the rights of emerging species. But their single dissent was drowned out by the overwhelming majority, who cared nothing for such principles. When the final tally was announced, Velkan smiled with deep satisfaction that made his mandibles spread wide. The motion had passed by a margin of 312 to 40-7. He wasted no time celebrating his victory. Standing before the assembly with supreme confidence, he announced that he would personally oversee the operation from Station Zinara. A fleet of 200 warships would depart immediately under the command of his most trusted officer, Commander Draxus, a veteran of countless campaigns who had never known defeat. The journey would take 6 standard rotations through hyperspace, and by the time the fleet returned victorious, humanity would be nothing more than a footnote in galactic history, remembered only as another primitive species that had been absorbed into the Thracian Empire. The delegates began to disperse, already moving on to other business as if nothing significant had happened. For them, the matter was settled and required no further thought. Earth was simply another primitive world about to be absorbed into the empire that ruled this region of space. There was nothing remarkable about it, nothing that distinguished it from the dozens of other worlds that had fallen before Thracian might. Kira remained in the gallery, long after the others had left, her hands trembling slightly, even as her expression remained perfectly calm. She had trained for moments like this during her preparation for the diplomatic mission. Though she had never truly believed it would come to pass, humanity had known about the Galactic Council for years, through intercepted transmissions and careful observation. They had studied alien technology recovered from crashed probes and prepared for the possibility of hostile contact. But knowing something intellectually and facing it in reality were 2 very different experiences. Thracian Guard approached her with cold efficiency and informed her that she was to be confined to her quarters until the operation was complete. However, as a gesture of diplomatic courtesy that the High Arbiter found amusing, she would be permitted to send one final message to her homeworld. Velkan wanted the humans to know what was coming. He wanted them to feel despair and hopelessness before the end arrived. Kira followed the guard to the communications center and sat down at the console. She had perhaps 5 minutes before the channel would be closed permanently. Her fingers moved across the interface, encoding a message with protocols that only United Earth Defense Command would recognize. On Earth, General Sam Patterson opened the transmission and read 4 simple words that changed everything. They are coming. Prepare. Patterson reached for his communicator and began issuing orders. Hidden bases around the world began to stir. Humanity had 6 rotations to prepare for the fight of their lives. Commander Draxus stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Conquest, watching the swirling colors of hyperspace flow past the observation windows like rivers of light. He was a veteran of 30 campaigns across the galaxy, and he had never lost a battle in his long and distinguished career. His exoskeleton was covered with medals and honors bestowed upon him by the High Arbiter himself, each one representing a world conquered or a rebellion crushed. This mission to the distant planet called Earth would add another decoration to his collectio. Though he doubted it would be particularly memorable, The fleet behind him was impressive by any standard. 200 warships of various classes traveled in perfect formation, their weapon systems fully charged and their crews eager for combat. There were heavy cruisers armed with plasma cannons that could melt through any known armor. There were carrier ships loaded with thousands of fighter craft ready to swarm any opposition. There were bombardment vessels designed to reduce cities to ash from orbit. It was enough firepower to conquer a dozen worlds. And Draxus was bringing all of it against a single primitive planet that had barely figured out how to leave its own atmosphere. He reviewed the intelligence reports for perhaps the 100th time during the journey. The humans possessed chemical rockets and primitive spacecraft that could barely reach their neighboring planets. They had nuclear weapons, which was mildly interesting, but nothing that could threaten ships protected by Thracian shielding technology. Their military forces were divided among numerous nations that constantly competed with each other for resources and influence. They had no unified command structure, no orbital defenses worth mentioning, and no experience fighting enemies from beyond their world. This would not be a battle. It would be an extermination. The hyperspace countdown reached 0. The fleet emerged into normal space near the ringed planet that humans called Saturn. Stars snapped into focus around them as reality reasserted itself. Draxus took a moment to orient himself using the navigation charts. The target planet was still several hours away at sublight speeds, a small blue dot barely visible among the countless stars. He ordered the fleet to assume attack formation and begin their approach. On Earth, alarms began sounding in command centers across the planet as long-range sensors detected the massive energy signatures of the emerging fleet. General Sam Patterson stood in the primary command bunker deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, surrounded by screens displaying real-time data from every sensor network humanity possessed. Secretary of Defense Laura Mitchell stood beside him, her face grim but determined as she watched the enemy ships arrange themselves into formation. The moment they had spent decades preparing for had finally arrived. Since the discovery of alien signals in 2031, humanity had secretly unified its military capabilities under a single command structure while maintaining the illusion of division and weakness. Nations that appeared to be rivals on the surface had been cooperating in shadow, pooling their resources and technology to prepare for an eventual confrontation with hostile forces from beyond their world. They had built hidden shipyards on the far side of the moon, weapons platforms disguised as communication satellites, and a fleet of warships that no alien observer had ever detected. Patterson opened a channel to the Lunar Defense Station and spoke calmly to the officers awaiting his orders. All units were to maintain concealment until the enemy crossed the designated threshold near Mars' orbit. They would let the Thracians come deeper into the solar system before revealing their true capabilities. The enemy expected to find primitives cowering in fear. They would find something very different waiting for them. Lieutenant Commander Jake Torres received his scramble order aboard the ESS Defiant, a sleek fighter craft hidden in a camouflaged hangar on the lunar surface. He was young but experienced, having logged more simulation hours than any other pilot in the fleet. Beside him, Captain Amy Chen ran through her preflit checklist with practiced efficiency. She was his wingmate and one of the finest combat pilots humanity had ever produced. With reflexes that bordered on supernatural and an instinct for battle that could not be taught, they launched together into the darkness of space. Joining hundreds of other fighters that rose from hidden bases across the moon, the pilots maintained strict communications silence as they took up positions behind asteroid clusters and debris fields. Waiting for the signal that would unleash them upon the unsuspecting enemy, Draxus received a standard surrender demand from his communications officer and approved it without much thought. The message was broadcast toward Earth on all frequencies, informing the humans that resistance was futile and that their only hope for survival lay in immediate capitulation. They were instructed to power down all weapons, ground all aircraft, and prepare to receive their new masters. Failure to comply would result in the complete destruction of their civilization. The response came faster than he expected. A human face appeared on his display, belonging to an older male with gray hair and cold eyes that showed no fear whatsoever. General Sam Patterson identified himself as the commander, of united Earth's defense and delivered a message that made Draxus pause. For the first time since the mission began, "You are trespassing in human space. Leave now or face the consequences." Draxus stared at the screen for a long moment, his mandibles clicking with what might have been amusement or confusion. The primitive was threatening him. The creature, whose species had only discovered fire a few thousand years ago, was actually threatening a Thrasian fleet commander with 200 warships at his disposal. It was almost admirable in its stupidity. Draxus closed the channel and ordered his fleet to advance. They would make an example of Earth that the entire galaxy would remember. The cruiser, Voidhammer, was leading the formation when it happened. One moment the ship was gliding smoothly through space, its weapons charging for the first orbital bombardment. The next moment, it vanished in a blinding flash of light that left nothing but expanding debris. The bridge of the Eternal Conquest shook as sensor systems overloaded from the sudden energy release before Draxus could process what had happened. 2 more cruisers exploded in identical fashion. Then 3 more, then 5. His fleet was flying into a minefield that no sensor had detected, and ships were dying faster than he could issue orders. The weapons were unlike anything in Thrasian databases, utilizing gravitational distortion technology that the humans should not have possessed. According to every intelligence report, panic began to spread through the fleet as commanders realized they were attacked by an enemy they could not see. Ships broke formation, trying to avoid the invisible death that surrounded them. But this only made them easier targets for the weapons platforms that were now activating throughout the asteroid belt. Beams of concentrated energy lanced out from rocks that had seemed completely inert moments before. Striking Thrasian vessels with devastating accuracy, Draxus screamed orders into his communicator. Trying to restore some semblance of order to the chaos engulfing his fleet, he commanded his ships to return fire on the source of the attacks. But the platforms were small and scattered across millions of kilometers of space. For every one they destroyed, 3 more seemed to activate and join the assault. Then the human fleet appeared. They emerged from behind the moon in perfect formation. 50 destroyers and 300 fighters moving with a coordination that spoke of years of training and preparation. At their head flew Admiral Nicole Harris aboard the carrier Constellation, her voice calm and steady as she issued commands to her captains. The battle for Earth had begun in earnest, and humanity intended to win. Jake Torres pushed his fighter to maximum acceleration, weaving through the chaos of the battlefield with Amy Chen close on his wing. Thrasian targeting computers tried to track his movements, but human pilots flew with a reckless creativity that defied all tactical logic. They had grown up playing video games and flight simulators, training their reflexes to react faster than conscious thought. Every maneuver they executed was improvised in the moment, impossible to predict and impossible to counter. Draxus watched, his fleet being torn apart, and realized with growing horror that he had made a terrible mistake. These were not primitives. These were warriors who had been waiting for this moment their entire lives, and they were winning. The Battle of Earth raged across millions of kilometers of space, and Commander Draxus found himself facing something he had never experienced in 30 campaigns across the galaxy. He was losing. The realization struck him like a physical blow as he watched another cruiser break, apart under concentrated fire from human destroyers. Its crew of 3,000 vanishing in an instant of searing plasma. His fleet had lost all cohesion within the first hour of combat. Ships that had never faced real opposition in living memory scrambled desperately to adapt to an enemy that refused to fight, according to any known tactical doctrine. The Thrasians had conquered dozens of worlds using the same strategies that had worked for millennia, overwhelming their opponents with superior firepower and unbreakable discipline. But the humans did not seem to know or care about proper military tactics. They fought like wild animals. It's unpredictable and vicious, and utterly without fear. Admiral Nicole Harris commanded the human fleet from the bridge of the Constellation, her eyes fixed on the tactical display as she coordinated the movements of her forces. She had spent 20 years preparing for this day, running countless simulations and training exercises that imagined every possible scenario. The reality was messier than any simulation, but her crews were performing beyond all expectations. The secret fleet that humanity had built in the shadows was proving its worth against an enemy that had expected to find easy prey. She issued orders with calm precision, directing strike teams to exploit gaps in the enemy formation and pulling damaged ships back for repairs. The human vessels were smaller than their Thracian counterparts, but they were faster and more maneuverable, designed specifically to fight the kind of war they were now waging. Their weapons were unconventional, using technologies that alien scientists had dismissed as theoretical impossibilities. Gravitational distortion missiles collapsed enemy shields from the inside. Kinetic impactors accelerated to relativistic speeds punched through armor that had never been breached. Electronic warfare systems scrambled Thracian communications and turned their own targeting. Computers against them, Commander. Greg Mason led a strike team of 20 fighters deep into the heart of the enemy formation, their objective being the communication relay ships that coordinated Thracian fleet movements. He was a former test pilot who had helped design the very craft he now flew, and he knew every capability and limitation of his machine. His team weaved through defensive fire that would have destroyed any normal pilot, exploiting blind spots in enemy sensor coverage that Mason had identified during years of careful observation. The first relay ship exploded under concentrated fire from his team, and suddenly a quarter of the enemy fleet went silent. Ships that had been maneuvering in coordinated patterns began drifting aimlessly, their commanders unable to receive orders or communicate with their companions. Mason and his team moved on to the next target, methodically dismantling the command structure that held the Thracian force together. On the ground, Colonel Daniel Price commanded the orbital defense platforms that humanity had hidden in plain sight for decades. What the aliens had dismissed as primitive communication arrays were actually massive railgun installations. Their barrels pointed toward the sky and loaded with tungsten projectiles the size of small cars. When the order came to engage, Price gave the command that unleashed devastation upon the enemy fleet. The railguns accelerated their projectiles to a significant fraction of light speed, launching them toward targets that were still hundreds of thousands of kilometers away. At those velocities, even simple kinetic rounds carried more energy than nuclear warheads. Thracian shields had been designed to deflect energy weapons, but they offered almost no protection against solid objects moving at relativistic speeds. The first salvo struck a heavy cruiser and tore it completely in half, sending both pieces tumbling away in opposite directions. More rounds followed in rapid succession, each one finding its target with computer-guided precision. Draxus watched helplessly as his capital ships were destroyed one after another by weapons he could not see coming until it was too late. The projectiles were too small and too fast to intercept, and by the time his sensors detected them, the impacts had already occurred. It was like fighting ghosts that struck without warning and vanished before retaliation was possible. Jake, Torres, and Amy Chen flew in perfect synchronization through the chaos of the battlefield, their fighters dancing between explosions and debris with an agility that seemed impossible. They had trained together for 5 years, and they knew each other's movements so well that words were almost unnecessary. A slight adjustment of wing position, a brief flash of running lights, and they communicated everything they needed to execute maneuvers that left enemy pilots struggling to track them. The Thracian fighter group attempted to intercept them. 6 craft moving in the standard triangular formation that their species had used for centuries. Jake and Amy split apart at the last possible moment, forcing the enemy to divide their attention before the Thracians could adjust. The 2 human pilots had circled around and destroyed 4 of them with precisely aimed missile strikes. The remaining 2 tried to flee, but Amy ran them down before they could escape, her weapons reducing them to scattered atoms. Draxus received damage reports from across his fleet, and each one was worse than the last. He had lost 60 ships in the first 2 hours of battle, with another 40 severely damaged and barely able to fight. His fighter squadrons had been decimated by human pilots who flew circles around them, exploiting every weakness in Thracian craft that their designers had never bothered to address. His communication network was in shambles, and he could barely coordinate the ships that remained under his command. He considered his options and found that he had very few. The humans had prepared for this invasion with a thoroughness that bordered on precognition. Every attack he launched was countered before it could develop, Every retreat was anticipated and cut off. Every advantage he thought he possessed was neutralized by technology and tactics that should not have existed. The primitives had turned out to be something else entirely, and Draxus had led his fleet into a trap from which there might be no escape. Admiral Harris saw the moment when the enemy finally broke. It happened suddenly, as it always did, in battles that had stretched beyond the point of endurance. One moment the Thracian ships were still fighting with desperate determination. The next moment they were running, every surviving vessel turning away from Earth and accelerating toward the outer system at maximum speed. She ordered her forces to pursue, unwilling to let any of the invaders escape to carry word of what had happened here. Human destroyers raced after fleeing enemy ships, picking off stragglers and forcing damaged vessels to surrender or be destroyed. Fighters swarmed over crippled cruisers. Finishing what the railguns and missiles had started, Draxus reached the hyperspace threshold with only 23 ships remaining from his original fleet of 200. He did not look back as his flagship made the jump to safety. Leaving behind the wreckage of his career and the bodies of tens of thousands of warriors who had followed him to their deaths, he would have to report this disaster to the High Arbiter, and he knew that the consequences would be severe. Behind him, humanity celebrated its first victory against an alien invasion. But General Patterson knew that this was only the beginning. The Thracians would not accept this defeat quietly, and the Galactic Council would soon learn what had happened to their mighty fleet. The galaxy was about to discover that humanity was not the primitive, divided species they had believed. Admiral Harris gathered her captains for a briefing as repair. Crews worked frantically to prepare the fleet for whatever came next. The humans had won the first battle, but the war was far from over. And somewhere across the galaxy, a message was already traveling toward Station Xenara. Carrying news that would shake the Council to its core, High Arbiter Velkin received the transmission from Commander Draxus in the private chambers adjoining the Council Hall. And for the first time in his long life, he found himself unable to speak. The message was brief and terrible, delivered by a commander whose voice shook with shame and disbelief. The fleet was destroyed. 177 ships had been lost, along with their crews. The invasion of Earth had failed catastrophically, and the survivors were limping home with tales of weapons and warriors that should not have existed. Velkin listened to the full report 3 times before he could accept that it was real. His finest fleet, equipped with weapons that had conquered dozens of worlds across the galaxy, had been crushed by primitives who had barely discovered space travel a century ago. The humans had hidden their true capabilities behind a facade of weakness and division, luring the Thracians into a trap that had been decades in the making. Every assumption that had guided the invasion had been wrong, and the price of that error was measured in the lives of hundreds of thousands of warriors. He summoned his advisors and demanded explanations that no one could provide. How had the humans developed gravitational distortion technology when every scientific analysis suggested they were generations away from such discoveries? How had they built a hidden fleet without any of the Thracian observers detecting the construction? How had they known the invasion was coming with enough time to prepare such comprehensive defenses? The questions multiplied with every passing hour. The answers remained frustratingly out of reach. The news spread through Station Xenara faster than Velkin could contain it. Delegates who had voted for the invasion began to distance themselves from the decision, claiming that they had been misled about the true nature of the human threat. Species that had remained silent during the debate now whispered among themselves about the implications of what had happened. The Thracian Empire had been humiliated by a species that most of the galaxy had never heard of, and the balance of power that had governed interstellar relations for millennia suddenly seemed less certain. Ambassador Kira Lawson remained confined to her quarters throughout the chaos, watching the developments through news feeds that she was not supposed to be able to access. She had managed to establish a hidden communication link using equipment smuggled in by sympathetic delegates. She received regular updates from Earth about the progress of the battle and its aftermath. Humanity had won, but she knew that the victory was only the beginning of a much longer struggle. The Council convened an emergency session to address the crisis. The chamber was more crowded than it had been in centuries. Every species with representation on the Council had sent delegates to witness what would happen next. And the observation galleries were packed with journalists and observers from across the galaxy. Velkin took his place at the central podium with considerably less confidence than he had displayed during the original vote, his mandibles clicking nervously as he faced the assembled representatives. Before he could speak, the great doors at the far end of the chamber opened with a sound that echoed through the crystalline halls. Every eye turned toward the entrance, and what they saw made even the oldest delegates gasp with astonishment. Ambassador Kira Lawson walked into the chamber. But she was no longer alone. Beside her strode Admiral Nicole Harris in full-dress uniform, her medals gleaming under the lights of the assembly hall. Behind them marched a contingent of 50 human soldiers in combat armor, their movements precise and their expressions revealing nothing. They advanced down the central aisle with the confidence of conquerors. And the delegates who had voted for their destruction shrank back as they passed. Kira took her place at the speaker's platform. Facing Velkin across a distance of perhaps 20 meters, she looked different than she had during her time as a mere observer. There was steel in her eyes now. Her voice carried an authority that demanded attention from every being in the chamber. Humanity had come to deliver a message. They had arrived aboard the S Horizon, a ship that had crossed the galaxy in mere days, using technology that the Council had believed impossible. The journey that took Thrasian ships 6 rotations had taken the humans less than 1. While the Council had been debating their response to the failed invasion, humanity had already traveled halfway, crossed known space to confront them directly. She paused to let the implications sink in before continuing. The attack on Earth had been an act of unprovoked aggression against a peaceful species that had sought only friendship. In cooperation with its galactic neighbors, the humans had done nothing to deserve destruction. Yet the Council had voted overwhelmingly to eliminate them based on nothing more than fear and prejudice. That decision had consequences, and humanity intended to see that justice was served. General Sam Patterson's face appeared on the main display, broadcast live from Earth. He looked older than he had during his defiant message to Commander Draxus, as if the weight of the past weeks had aged him considerably. But his voice was steady, and his words were carefully chosen as he presented humanity's demands to the assembled council first. The Thrasian Empire would pay reparations to Earth for the attempted invasion. The amount would be determined by a neutral committee, but it would be substantial enough to ensure that aggressive warfare was never again seen as a cost-free option. Second, High Arbiter Velkin would be removed from his position and placed on trial for crimes against a peaceful species. He had ordered the attack, and he would face the consequences of that order. Third, humanity would be granted full membership in the Galactic Council with all associated rights and protections, effective immediately. The alternative, Patterson said calmly, was war. Not the limited conflict that the Thrasians had initiated, but total war waged with every resource at humanity's disposal. The Council had seen what human forces could accomplish when defending their home. They should consider carefully what those same forces might accomplish on the offensive. Velkin rose from his seat, his mandibles spreading wide with outrage that overwhelmed his fear. He could not accept such humiliating terms. The Thracian Empire had ruled this region of space for 10,000 years, and they would not bow to upstart primitives who had simply gotten lucky in a single battle. He called upon the other species of the Council to stand with him against this threat, to unite their forces and crush humanity once and for all. The chamber remained silent. No one spoke in support of the High Arbiter. No one rose to defend the empire that had dominated them for so long. The delegates looked at the human soldiers standing guard in the aisles, at the ship that had crossed the galaxy in impossible time, at the face of the general who had destroyed a Thrasian fleet without losing a single vessel of his own, and they made their calculations. The vote was called, and the result was decisive. By a margin of 378 to 6, the Council accepted humanity's terms. Velkin stood alone at his podium, abandoned by every ally and stripped of every protection. Human soldiers approached him with restraints, and he did not resist as they placed them around his wrists. Kira Lawson watched as the being who had ordered her species destroyed was led away in chains. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a profound weariness and a hope that the worst was finally over. Humanity had proven itself in the most definitive way possible, but the real challenge lay ahead. They would have to build relationships with species that had tried to exterminate them, navigate political waters more treacherous than any battlefield, and find their place in a galaxy that suddenly seemed much smaller than it had before. Admiral Akaris stepped up beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "They had one," she said quietly. But Kira understood what she really meant. The war was over. Now came the harder work of building peace. The weeks following humanity's dramatic entrance into galactic politics passed in a blur of negotiations, ceremonies, and the slow work of building a new order from the wreckage of the old. High Arbiter Velkin was tried before a tribunal composed of representatives from 12 neutral species. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He had ordered an unprovoked attack against a peaceful world, ignored warnings about the risks involved, and sent hundreds of thousands of warriors to their deaths in pursuit of personal glory. The tribunal found him guilty on all charges and sentenced him to permanent exile on a barren moon at the edge of known space, where he would spend the remainder of his days contemplating the consequences of his arrogance. Ambassador Kira Lawson took her permanent seat on the Galactic Council, the first human to hold such a position in the history of interstellar civilization. When she spoke, the assembled representatives listened with a respect that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The primitive species from the distant spiral arm had proven themselves in battle, and that proof carried weight that no amount of diplomatic maneuvering could have achieved. Humanity had earned its place at the table through blood and fire, and no one would soon forget the lesson they had taught. The galaxy learned more about their new partners in the weeks and months that followed, and what they discovered both fascinated and disturbed them. Humans had survived ice ages that would have exterminated most species. They had endured plagues that killed half their population and emerged stronger than before. They had fought countless wars among themselves, developing weapons of increasing destructiveness that they somehow managed not to use for their own annihilation. They had looked at the vast emptiness of space and decided to fill it with dreams of exploration and discovery. Captain Mi Chen was promoted to commander and given her own ship, the S, Vigilant, tasked with patrolling the borders of human space and monitoring for any signs of renewed hostility. She took to her new responsibilities with the same dedication that had made her one of the finest combat pilots in the fleet, and her crew quickly learned to trust her judgment in any situation. She missed flying fighters, but she understood that leadership required sacrifices, and she was prepared to make them for the good of her people. Jake Torres returned to Earth as a hero. Though he insisted to anyone who would listen that he had just been doing his job, the media wanted to make him a symbol of human courage and skill, but he preferred to spend his time training the next generation of pilots who would defend Earth against future threats. He knew that the galaxy was watching, and he wanted to make sure that humanity was always prepared for whatever challenges might arise. Colonel Daniel Price oversaw the expansion of planetary defenses across the solar system, turning the lessons learned from the Battle of Earth into a comprehensive shield that would protect humanity for generations to come. New railgun platforms were constructed on the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. Sensor networks were extended to the outer reaches of the system. Hidden bases were established in the asteroid belt, ready to deploy at a moment's notice if another invasion ever came. Commander Greg Mason was assigned to a Special Projects Division, working to reverse engineer captured Thrasian technology and integrate it with human systems. The aliens had possessed certain advantages in power generation and shielding that humanity lacked, but human ingenuity was already finding ways to improve upon their designs. Within a few years, the technological gap that had once seemed insurmountable would be closed entirely. General Sam Patterson retired from active service 6 months after the battle, his health declining from the stress of commanding humanity's defenses during the crisis. He gave a final address to the Joint Defense Council, warning them to remain vigilant, even in times of peace. The galaxy had learned to respect humanity, but respect could fade, while resentment endured. Future generations would need to remember the lessons of this conflict and ensure that Earth was never again caught unprepared. Admiral Nicole Harris took over as the Supreme Commander of United Earth Defense, the first woman to hold the position. She reorganized the fleet around the principles that had proven successful against the Thracians, emphasizing speed and adaptability over raw firepower. She established exchange programs with friendly alien species, allowing human officers to learn from their counterparts, while sharing some of the tactical innovations that had surprised the galaxy. The relationships she built would prove invaluable in the decades ahead. In the quiet aftermath of the crisis, an elder delegate from the Morvani Collective approached Ambassador Lawson with a question that had been troubling him since the humans first revealed their true capabilities. The Morvani were philosophers and scholars, more interested in understanding the universe than conquering it. Their representative was ancient, even by his species standards, with memory stretching back thousands of years and wisdom accumulated across countless diplomatic encounters. He wanted to know why humanity had hidden their strength for so long. The humans clearly possessed the technology to have deterred the invasion before it ever began. They could have revealed their fleet and their weapons the moment Ambassador Lawson arrived at Station Zanara, making it clear that any attack would be met with devastating retaliation. Instead, they had allowed themselves to appear weak, permitted the Council to vote for their destruction, and waited until the enemy was committed before showing their hand. Why take such a terrible risk when simpler options were available? Kira considered the question carefully before answering. She thought about the history of her species, about the countless conflicts they had endured, and the lessons they had learned through centuries of struggle. She thought about the nature of power and the ways it could be wielded, about the difference between being feared and being respected, about the price that had to be paid for lasting peace. We needed the galaxy to understand something important, she said finally. Her voice was soft, but it carried clearly to the elder, who listened with patient attention. We would prefer peace, she continued. We will always offer friendship first. We reached out to the Council seeking cooperation and mutual benefit, hoping to take our place among the stars as partners rather than conquerors. That was our sincere intention, and it remains our sincere intention today. But if you threaten our home and our people, she said with an edge of steel entering her voice, we will respond with everything we have. We will not negotiate while invaders approach our world. We will not beg for mercy from those who have decided to destroy us. We will fight with every weapon at our disposal, and we will not stop fighting until the threat is eliminated, or we are. The elder nodded slowly, his ancient eyes studying her with newfound understanding. He had watched empires rise and fall across millennia, and he recognized something in this young species that he had not seen in a very long time. They possessed a fire that could warm or burn depending on how it was approached. They would be dangerous enemies or powerful allies, and the galaxy would have to choose carefully how to engage with them. The lesson had been taught. The galaxy would not soon forget it. Humanity had been tested in the crucible of war and had not been found wanting. They had proven that they would not submit to tyranny, that they would defend their home against any threat, that they possessed the strength to back up their principles with action. The species that had seemed so primitive and divided had revealed themselves as something far more formidable. In the years that followed, humanity spread across the galaxy, establishing colonies and trading posts and research stations among the stars. They made friends with species that had once voted for their destruction, finding common ground through commerce and cultural exchange. They discovered wonders beyond anything their ancestors had imagined, and faced challenges that tested them in new ways. But they never forgot the lesson of the Battle of Earth. They remembered that the galaxy could be hostile, that strength was the foundation of peace, and that vigilance was the price of survival. And whenever a new species emerged from the darkness between the stars, humanity was there to greet them with an offer of friendship backed by the quiet promise of devastating force if that friendship was refused. The primitives from the distant spiral arm had found their place among the stars, and the galaxy had learned to respect them.